She was stripped of her packmark, thrown into a freezing blizzard, and told to die just because she refused to abandon a crying infant found in the snow. Her Alpha thought he was executing a weak Omega. He didn't know he had just banished the Alpha King's only heir. The winters in the Oregon Cascades were notoriously unforgiving, but for Clara Higgins, the chill of the Silver Pines pack house was far worse than any blizzard. At 22, Clara was the pack's designated Omega, a glorified servant whose only crime was being born to parents who had challenged the current leadership and lost. She spent her days scrubbing floors, mending clothes, and keeping her head down to avoid the wrath of Alpha Dominic Reed. Dominic was a cruel, vain man who ruled his territory with an iron fist and a fragile ego. It was the evening of November 14th when Clara's life ruptured permanently. She had been sent out to the far eastern border to gather winterbane root, a ridiculous and dangerous errand in the middle of a gathering snowstorm. The wind was howling, biting through her threadbare jacket, when she heard it. A faint, desperate sound carrying over the whistle of the wind. A whimper. Clara froze, her own wolf perking its ears. She abandoned her basket and waded through the knee-deep snow, following the sound into a thicket of dead blackberry bushes. There, tucked between the frozen roots of an ancient pine, was a bundle of dark, blood-soaked fabric. Clara dropped to her knees. Her breath hitched as she pulled back the heavy wool. Inside was an infant, barely a few weeks old. His tiny face was blue with cold, his breathing shallow, but what struck Clara instantly was the scent. Beneath the metallic tang of dried blood and the damp smell of the earth, the baby radiated an aura that made Clara's inner wolf instinctively want to bare its neck. It was a scent of raw, unadulterated power, petrichor, ozone, and cedar. "Oh, sweet goddess," Clara whispered, pulling the baby against her chest to share her body heat. She didn't think about the blood. She didn't think about the danger. She only knew she had to save him. Clara sprinted the 3 miles back to the pack house, her lungs burning, the baby tucked safely inside her coat. She burst through the heavy oak doors of the main hall, gasping for air, leaving a trail of melting snow and mud on the pristine hardwood. The hall fell dead silent. Alpha Dominic, who had been sitting by the massive stone fireplace with his beta, Harrison Cole, turned his head slowly. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, locked onto Clara with immediate disgust. "What is the meaning of this, Clara?" Dominic growled, his voice vibrating with alpha command. "You track mud into my hall, and you smell of—" He paused, his nostrils flaring. "Blood. Rogue blood. Alpha," Clara panted, trembling as she stepped forward and opened her coat. "I found him on the eastern border. He was freezing. Someone left him to die." Dominic stood up, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He looked down at the infant, his lip curling into a sneer. The baby stirred, opening his eyes. They were a striking, unnatural amber, glowing even in the dim light of the hall. For a fraction of a second, Dominic recoiled, sensing the sheer density of the child's aura. But his fear quickly morphed into rage. A child this powerful, smelling of unfamiliar blood, was a threat. "That is a rogue's whelp," Dominic spat. "Probably dropped by some feral bitch on the run. Get it out of my house." Clara stared at him, horrified. "He's an infant, Dominic. He will die out there." The room gasped. An Omega did not use the Alpha's first name. An Omega did not raise her voice. Dominic's hand shot out, wrapping around Clara's throat. He lifted her off her feet. Clara choked, her hands instinctively tightening around the baby to protect him from the violent jolt. "You forget your place, Omega," Dominic whispered, his breath hot against her face. "You bring a filthy, bleeding rogue rat into my territory, and you dare to question me? Beta Harrison, take the child. Throw it in the river." Harrison stepped forward, reaching for the bundle. Survival instincts Clara didn't know she possessed flared to life. She kicked hard, her heavy winter boot catching Dominic in the knee. The Alpha grunted in surprise and dropped her. Clara hit the floor, scrambling backward, clutching the baby to her chest. Her wolf, usually submissive and quiet, was snarling, willing to tear out the throat of anyone who touched the child. "No," Clara screamed, her eyes flashing gold. "I won't let you!" Dominic straightened up, his face flushed with a psychotic rage. He wiped a speck of dust from his shirt, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. "Fine," he said smoothly. "If you love the rogue trash so much, you can die with it." He turned to the gathered pack members, projecting his voice. "Clara Higgins has committed treason against her alpha. She has allied herself with rogue blood. As of this moment, I strip her of her rank, her home, and her protection." Dominic stepped forward and violently grabbed Clara by the shoulder. He dug his claws into the crook of her neck, right over her pack mark. Clara screamed in agony as he violently severed the spiritual bond tethering her to the Silver Pines. It felt like her soul was being shredded through a meat grinder. Blood poured down her collarbone. "Throw her out," Dominic commanded. "If she steps foot on my territory again, kill her." Two massive enforcers grabbed Clara by her arms, dragging her bleeding, weeping form toward the doors. They threw her out into the raging blizzard, slamming the heavy doors shut. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot. Clara lay in the snow, shivering violently, blood freezing on her neck. She looked down at the baby. He wasn't crying anymore. He was looking up at her with those intelligent, glowing amber eyes. "It's just you and me, little one," she sobbed, forcing herself to her feet. "I won't let us die. I promise." The first 48 hours of exile were a blur of hypothermia, starvation, and pure adrenaline. Clara marched north, away from Silver Pines territory, navigating the brutal mountain passes. Miraculously, the baby whom she had started calling Leo seemed to generate an unnatural amount of body heat. Whenever Clara felt she was about to succumb to the frost, a warm, pulsing energy radiated from the child against her chest, reviving her. On the third day, Clara stumbled upon an abandoned hunter's cabin near the edge of the neutral zone, miles from anywhere. It was rotting and drafted, but it had a cast-iron stove and a stockpile of chopped wood. She collapsed onto the dusty floorboards, weeping with relief. Over the next week, Clara fell into a rhythm of survival. She set snares for rabbits, melted snow for water, and fashioned on the baby's left shoulder blade, clear as ink, was a distinct birthmark. It wasn't just a random splotch. It looked exactly like a crescent moon cradling a wolf's paw, topped with a jagged crown. Clara traced it with a trembling finger. She had heard stories, myths whispered among Omegas when the Alphas weren't listening. The royal mark. But that was impossible. The royal court was in Aspen, Colorado, hundreds of miles away. Why would a royal baby be abandoned in the Oregon woods? 400 miles away, the Alpha King was currently turning the continent into a graveyard. King Silas Montgomery was 28, standing 6'4", a mountain of muscle, lethal grace, and currently unfathomable grief. 3 weeks ago, his life had been perfect. But on a diplomatic trip to the West Coast, his motorcade had been ambushed by a highly organized, heavily armed faction of rogues. They hadn't come for money. They had come for blood. His mate, Queen Genevieve, had been murdered in the chaos, and his newborn son, Prince Alistair, had been snatched from her arms. Since that day, Silas hadn't slept. He hadn't stopped. He had personally executed 30 rogues, tearing through their ranks in his massive midnight black wolf form, searching for a single clue. His kingdom was terrified. The Alpha King was rapidly losing his grip on his humanity, his wolf taking over in a blind, agonizing frenzy to find his heir. "My king." A voice broke through Silas's dark thoughts. It was Gideon Shaw, his lead tracker and closest confidant. Gideon stepped into the command tent, his face pale but resolute. "We found a trail, a faint scent of the Queen's blood mixed with the prince's. It was disguised by winterbane root, but the blizzard washed the masking agent away." Silas stood up, the heavy oak table groaning as he leaned his weight on it. His eyes were completely black, his wolf pacing just beneath his skin. "Where?" "The Oregon Cascades, near the border of the Silver Pines pack. Prepare the guard," Silas snarled, his voice a terrifying, guttural rumble. "We leave immediately. If the Silver Pines Alpha had a hand in this, I will mount his head on my gates." Back at the cabin, Clara's luck had finally run out. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Clara had stepped out to check her snares, leaving Leo asleep in a padded crate by the stove. She was only 50 yards away when the wind shifted, bringing a scent that made her blood run cold. Wet dog, rotting meat, and malice. Rogues. She dropped her rabbit and sprinted for the cabin. She burst through the door, scooping Leo into her arms just as the windows shattered. 3 massive, mangy wolves lunged into the small space, their jaws snapping. These weren't ordinary rogues. They had purpose. They locked eyes on the baby. Clara realized with terrifying clarity these were the ones who had left him to die. They had come back to finish the job. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the back door, sprinting into the dense forest. She couldn't shift, holding the baby made it impossible, and her wolf was too weak from starvation anyway. She relied on pure human desperation, dodging through the pines, the snarls of the rogues hot on her heels. A heavy paw struck her back, sending her crashing into the snow. She twisted mid-air, taking the brunt of the fall on her shoulder to protect Leo. The baby began to cry, a loud, piercing wail that echoed through the mountains. The lead rogue, a massive gray beast with a missing eye, stood over her, drool dripping from its jaws. It lunged for the child. Clara closed her eyes, wrapping her body entirely around Leo, waiting for the teeth to tear into her flesh. Crack. The sound of snapping bone was deafening. Clara opened her eyes just in time to see the gray rogue violently ripped away from her. The forest had exploded into chaos. 5 enormous wolves, larger than any Clara had ever seen, had descended upon the clearing. They moved with military precision, lethal and terrifying, but it was the wolf in the center that stole the breath from her lungs. He was a monster of a wolf, his fur as black as a starless night. He stood almost at chest height to a grown man. In one fluid motion, the black wolf crushed the skull of the gray rogue beneath his jaws, tossing the lifeless body aside like a rag doll. Within seconds, the other 2 rogues were dead, dispatched by the guard. The black wolf turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Clara. His eyes were the same brilliant, unnatural amber as the baby in her arms. The wolf shifted. Bones popped and reformed in a split second, and a man stood before her. He was covered in blood that wasn't his chest heaving, his dark hair falling over his forehead. The sheer power radiating from him made Clara's chest tighten. It was the same aura that came from Leo, but magnified 1,000 times. Silas Montgomery stepped forward, the snow melting instantly beneath his bare feet. His eyes darted from the torn, bloody blanket in Clara's arms to her terrified face. The scent of his dead mate's blood was on that blanket. Silas's vision tinted red. He didn't see a savior. He saw a filthy, packless rogue holding his stolen son. In a flash, Silas crossed the distance. He pinned Clara against the trunk of a massive pine tree, his forearm pressing against her collarbone, right above her infected rejection scar. "Don't hurt him!" Clara screamed, trying to twist her body to shield the baby from this terrifying stranger. "Where did you get that child?" Silas roared, his voice shaking the snow from the branches above them. "Tell me before I tear you apart piece by piece." Clara, trembling violently, looked up into the eyes of the Alpha King. I found him. I saved him." Silas looked down at the baby. Leo had stopped crying. The infant reached out a tiny, chubby hand, grabbing one of Silas's blood-stained fingers. Silas's breath hitched. The murderous rage in his eyes fractured, replaced instantly by a devastating, raw agony. He dropped to his knees in the snow, pulling Clara and the baby down with him, burying his face in the child's blanket. Clara sat frozen in the snow, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing with a slow, dawning shock exactly whose child her former Alpha had ordered her to throw away. The journey to the royal court in Aspen, Colorado, was a terrifying blur of roaring helicopter blades and sterile medical equipment. Clara had collapsed in the snow the moment the adrenaline faded, her body finally giving out to the rampant infection festering in her severed packmark. When she woke, she wasn't in a frozen, drafty cabin. She was buried beneath a mountain of heated-down comforters in a room that smelled of antiseptic and expensive lavender. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies loomed like silent sentinels. Clara jolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Leo!" she gasped, her hands frantically searching the empty bed beside her. "The prince is safe, Clara." The voice came from the shadows near the door. King Silas Montgomery stepped into the dim light of the medical bay. He was no longer covered in the gore of the forest. He wore a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light, his dark hair slicked back, but his amber eyes were just as feral and exhausted as they had been in the woods. Clara shrank back against the pillows, her hand instinctively flying to her neck. The ragged, torn flesh of her rejection scar had been cleaned, stitched, and bandaged, but the phantom pain of being packless still throbbed with every heartbeat. "His name is Alistair," Silas continued, walking slowly toward the foot of her bed. "He is the royal heir. And you, Clara Higgins, have a lot of explaining to do." Gideon Shaw, the lead tracker Clara had seen in the woods, entered the room behind the king. He held a sleek tablet, his expression unreadable. "We ran your DNA and your scent profile," Gideon stated, his voice clinical. "You are an unregistered Omega, formerly of the Silver Pines Pack, under Alpha Dominic Reed. Your pack mark was forcibly severed exactly 8 days ago. The wound was heavily infected. Dr. Aris said you were hours away from sepsis." "I didn't steal him," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear it on the goddess. I found him in the snow on the eastern border of our territory. He was wrapped in a bloody blanket. I tried to bring him to my Alpha. I tried to get him help." Silas's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked beneath his cheekbone. And what did Alpha Dominic do when an infant, reeking of royal blood, was brought into his hall? Tears spilled over Clara's eyelashes. The memory of Dominic's hand around her throat was still fresh. He called him rogue trash. He ordered his beta to throw the baby in the freezing river. A low, terrifying growl vibrated through the room. It didn't come from Silas's throat. It seemed to emanate from the very walls of the compound. The temperature in the room plummeted. Silas gripped the metal railing at the foot of Clara's bed, and the thick steel groaned, bending under his supernatural strength. "He ordered my son to be drowned," Silas repeated softly. The quietness of his voice was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "I fought them," Clara said, lifting her chin, her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit to the king's overwhelming aura, but her human willpower holding her steady. "I kicked the Alpha. I took the baby and I ran. Dominic stripped my mark and threw me into the blizzard to die. The rogues in the woods. They were the ones who left Leo Alistair in the snow. They came back to finish the job." Gideon looked up from his tablet, exchanging a dark, significant look with the king. "My king," Gideon murmured. "Silver Pines territory borders the exact stretch of highway where the Queen's motorcade was ambushed. If a pack of organized rogues moved through that area, Dominic Reed would have smelled them. He would have known they were there." "He didn't just know," Silas snarled, his eyes bleeding to pitch black. "He allowed it. Dominic gave them safe passage in exchange for a cut of the plunder, not realizing they were carrying the Crown Prince. And when the evidence showed up on his doorstep, he tried to bury it." Before Silas could give the order to mobilize, the heavy oak doors of the medical bay swung open. Lady Victoria Sterling, a high-ranking noble wolf from a powerful allied pack, swept into the room. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with icy blonde hair and piercing green eyes, but the sneer on her lips ruined the effect. "Silas, darling," Victoria cooed, pointedly ignoring Clara. "The council is in an uproar. The rumors are flying that you brought a packless, feral Omega into the royal compound. They are demanding the prince be handed over to the royal nannies immediately. It is entirely inappropriate for a rogue to have her scent on the future king." Clara bristled. She might have been an Omega, but she had kept that baby alive with her own body heat and sheer willpower. "She is not a rogue, Victoria," Silas snapped, his tone laced with absolute authority. "She is the woman who saved my son's life when her own Alpha condemned him to death. She will be treated with the respect befitting a savior of the crown." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she finally looked at Clara, sizing up her pale skin and threadbare hospital gown. "She is an Omega, Silas. A broken one at that. She has no place here. Her place," Silas said, stepping between Victoria and Clara's bed, A protective barrier of pure alpha energy is wherever I deem it to be. Get out, Victoria. Flushed with embarrassment and rage, Victoria spun on her heel and stormed out. Silas turned back to Clara. The blackness had faded from his eyes, leaving behind a profound, exhaustion-laced gratitude. Rest, Clara. Dr. Aris will bring Alistair to you soon. He refuses to eat for the wet nurses. He only cries until he smells your scent. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, a small, watery smile touching her lips. I'd like that very much, Your Majesty. Call me Silas, he said softly, before turning to his beta. Gideon, assemble the Royal Guard. We are taking a trip to Oregon. 4 days later, Clara stood on the tarmac of the Aspen Royal compound, wrapped in a thick, luxurious sable coat that Silas had personally ordered for her. Her neck was still bandaged, but the infection was gone, and her strength had returned. In her arms, tightly bundled against the winter chill, was Prince Alistair. Silas stood beside her, flanked by 50 of the most lethal, highly trained enforcers in the North American continent. They were dressed in tactical black, their faces grim, their wolves practically vibrating beneath their skin with the anticipation of righteous violence. Are you sure you want to do this, Clara? Silas asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the whine of the jet engines. You don't have to face him. I can bring you his head on a silver platter if you wish. Clara looked down at Alistair, who was happily chewing on the collar of her coat. She thought of the years of abuse she had suffered at Dominic's hands, the degrading labor, the cruel taunts, and finally, the horrific agony of having her soul forcibly untethered from her home. I need to be there, Clara said firmly, meeting the king's amber eyes. I need him to see that he didn't break me, and I need him to know exactly what he threw away. Silas's lips twitched into a rare, dangerous smile, spoken like a true wolf. The flight to Oregon was swift and silent. When they landed at a private airstrip near the Cascades, a fleet of armored black SUVs was waiting. Clara rode in the lead vehicle with Silas, Gideon, and the prince. As they crossed the invisible boundary line into Silver Pines territory, Clara felt a phantom ache in her neck, but the overwhelming presence of the king beside her acted as an anchor, steadying her trembling hands. At the Silver Pines pack house, it was a typical, dreary Thursday. Alpha Dominic Reed was sitting at the head of his long dining table, feasting on a massive steak, surrounded by his sycophantic inner circle. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the pack house didn't just open. They were violently blown off their hinges. Wood splintered and showered across the grand hall as two massive royal enforcers marched inside, their assault rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes glowing with lethal intent. The hall erupted in panic. Dominic leapt to his feet, his beta Harrison drawing a weapon, but they froze instantly. The sheer, suffocating weight of an Alpha King's aura flooded the room, forcing every wolf in the hall, including Dominic, to their knees. It felt like gravity had suddenly quadrupled. Silas Montgomery strolled through the shattered doorway, his boots crunching loudly on the splintered wood. He didn't look like a grieving widower. He looked like the god of war. Alpha Dominic, Silas said, his voice echoing in the dead, silent hall. You have terrible security. Dominic, struggling against the oppressive aura, forced his head up. His face was pale with terror. King Silas, to what do we owe this profound honor? We received no word of your arrival. I am not here for pleasantries, Dominic, Silas said, stopping a few feet away from the kneeling Alpha. I am here regarding a border violation, specifically the heavily armed rogues you allowed to pass through your eastern mountain pass 3 weeks ago. Dominic swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. My king, I assure you, we hunt rogues relentlessly. If any slipped through, it was an oversight. An oversight that cost me my mate, Silas roared, the sound physically vibrating the glass in the windows. Dominic flinched, curling inward. An oversight that resulted in my newborn son being left to die in a blizzard. Your son? Dominic stammered, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The puzzle pieces were slamming together in his mind, forming a picture of his own imminent execution. Silas turned his head toward the doorway. Clara, Come forward." The entire pack gasped as Clara Higgins stepped into the hall. She was no longer the frail, dirty Omega in threadbare clothes. Wrapped in royal furs, her chin held high, she radiated a quiet, unshakable strength. And in her arms, looking healthy and content, was the baby Dominic had ordered drowned. Dominic's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "Clara?" he whispered. "Hello, Alpha," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "I told you he wasn't rogue trash." "You ordered my son drowned," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He stepped closer to Dominic, grabbing the Alpha by the collar of his shirt and hoisting him to his feet. "You stripped a heroic woman of her mark, threw her into a blizzard, and tried to murder the heir to the throne." "I didn't know," Dominic shrieked, his Alpha facade completely shattering. He scrambled for excuses, tears of terror streaming down his face. "She smelled like a rogue. The baby smelled like blood. I was protecting my pack." "You were protecting your own pathetic ego," Silas growled. "You took bribes from the rogues who killed Queen Genevieve. We found the offshore accounts, Dominic. You sold your honor, and then you tried to murder my son to cover your tracks." Silas didn't give Dominic a chance to beg. With a brutal, fluid motion, Silas drove his fist into Dominic's chest, channeling his raw Alpha power. The sound of ribs shattering echoed through the hall. He didn't kill him instantly. Silas wanted him to suffer the exact pain he had inflicted on Clara. Silas dug his claws into Dominic's neck, violently severing Dominic's connection to the Silver Pines pack. Dominic screamed a high, agonizing sound as his Alpha status was ripped away, leaving him a broken, packless rogue. He collapsed to the floor, weeping and convulsing. Silas turned his gaze to the rest of the terrified pack. Dominic Reed is stripped of his title and banished. He will be thrown into the eastern border blizzards, just as he did to Clara. If he survives the night, he is an enemy of the crown. As for the rest of you, Silas looked at Beta Harrison, who was trembling violently. You were complicit. You are under arrest for treason. My enforcers will dismantle this pack's leadership. Gideon Shaw will act as your interim Alpha until a suitable replacement is found. Silas turned his back on the wreckage of the Silver Pines leadership and walked back to Clara. He gently reached out, brushing a knuckle against Prince Alistair's cheek. The baby giggled, grabbing the king's finger. Silas looked up, his amber eyes softening as they met Clara's. It's done. Your ghosts are buried. Let's go home. The transition back to Aspen was a rebirth for Clara. With the threat of Dominic erased and the silver-tongued nobles of the court silenced by the king's terrifying display of loyalty, Clara finally found peace. She was given a permanent suite in the royal compound, connected directly to the prince's nursery. Officially, she was named the Royal Guardian, a title Silas invented specifically to ensure no one could ever question her authority or rank. Unofficially, she was the heartbeat of the castle. Months turned into a year. The icy halls of the compound thawed under Clara's presence. She refused to let servants do all the work, often found in the royal kitchens baking bread, with a babbling, toddling Prince Alistair strapped to her back. But the most profound change was in King Silas. The grief that had threatened to consume him, to turn him into a feral monster, slowly ebbed away. He found himself seeking Clara out, not just for updates on his son, but for her quiet wisdom, her gentle laugh, and the fierce, protective fire that flashed in her eyes whenever she felt Alistair was threatened. It was late December, precisely 1 year after the blizzard that had changed their lives. Clara was sitting on the thick rug in front of the fireplace in Silas's private study, building a tower of wooden blocks for Alistair to delightfully smash. Silas watched them from his desk, a stack of unread treaties pushed to the side. He stood up, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid, and walked over, handing one to Clara before sitting on the rug beside her. He's getting faster, Silas murmured, watching his son chase a rolling block under the sofa. He shifted his eyes today, Clara said, a proud smile lighting up her face. Just for a second. They went full gold. He's going to be incredibly powerful, Silas. Silas looked at Clara, really looked at her. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the faint, silvery scar on her neck, a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. Clara's breath hitched. She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. Over the past year, the deep gratitude and mutual respect had simmered into something profoundly intense, an undeniable gravitational pull between them. "He is powerful because he was raised by a warrior," Silas said softly. "You saved him, Clara. But I don't think you realize. You saved me, too." Clara leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes shining. "I didn't have anything to live for before I found him in the snow. You gave me a home, Silas. You gave me a family. I want to give you more," Silas whispered, his face moving closer to hers, the scent of petrichor and cedar wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "I want to give you everything. If you'll have me." Clara didn't answer with words. She closed the distance, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a hesitant question, before it ignited into a fiery, desperate answer. It was a promise of healing, of shared futures, and of a bond forged not by a predetermined goddess, but by choice, sacrifice, and unbreakable loyalty. As they pulled away, resting their foreheads together, little Alistair babbled loudly, slapping a wooden block against Silas's knee. They both laughed, the sound bright and warm against the winter night outside. Clara pulled the little prince into her lap, resting her head against the king's shoulder. Finally, truly, safe. Clara Higgins was thrown into the snow to die as a discarded Omega, but her fierce compassion rewrote her destiny. By saving a helpless infant, she didn't just rescue the future Alpha King. She unexpectedly found her true family. From the frozen ashes of her rejection rose a formidable woman who would forever stand beside King Silas, turning a story of brutal betrayal into a legacy of pure, unwavering love.